The sun was dipping below the horizon as Sarah and Jake unloaded the last of their boxes into the old Victorian house they'd just bought. After months of searching, they had finally found their dream home, an expansive, picturesque place that seemed perfect. The house, built in the 1800s, had a charm that felt both inviting and slightly eerie, but they were determined to make it their own. The real estate agent had been insistent that the house was a great deal, because it had been on the market for so long. "It's got character," she'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah and Jake had brushed off her odd demeanor as nerves over their purchase. The first night was filled with the usual new home hustle. They unpacked, arranged furniture, and marveled at the antique details of their new home. The old oak floors creaked underfoot, and the grand staircase seemed to whisper stories of the past. Despite the initial excitement, as night settled in, an unsettling silence enveloped the house. After a dinner of takeout, Jake went to bed early, exhausted from the day's work. Sarah, still energized, decided to explore the house a bit more. She roamed from room to room, admiring the intricate woodwork and old-fashioned wallpaper. The attic door, partially concealed behind a heavy curtain, caught her eye. Curiosity got the best of her, and she decided to investigate. The attic was small and dusty, filled with old trunks and forgotten furniture. A large mirror stood against one wall, covered in a white sheet. Sarah pulled the sheet off and found herself staring into the mirror, her own reflection looking back at her, though the edges of the image seemed to waver strangely. As Sarah studied the mirror, she noticed something odd. A faint, shadowy figure moving behind her reflection. She spun around, but the attic was empty. Laughing nervously at her own jumpiness, she turned back to the mirror. The shadow was still there, growing clearer. It was the outline of a woman in old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by shadows, but her eyes piercingly bright. Feeling a chill, Sarah covered the mirror again and decided it was time to call it a night. As she descended the stairs, she heard a soft, mournful sound, like someone crying. The sound seemed to echo from the walls themselves. She paused, straining to identify the source, but the noise faded as quickly as it had begun. Back in bed, Sarah tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. Jake was already asleep, snoring softly. As she lay in the dark, she noticed a faint glow coming from under their bedroom door. She sat up and listened carefully. The crying sound was now louder, more distinct. It was definitely coming from somewhere in the house. Unable to ignore it any longer, Sarah slipped out of bed and followed the sound. It seemed to be coming from the basement. She hesitated for a moment, but felt a compulsion to investigate. The basement, like the attic, was a dark, uninviting space. The old rusty door creaked as she opened it, and the dim light from a single bulb barely illuminated the steps. As Sarah descended the stairs, the crying grew louder, more urgent. The air was colder here, and her breath came out in visible puffs. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. In the middle of the room stood a small wooden crib, an anachronism in the otherwise dusty space. The crib was rocking gently back and forth, though there was no breeze or visible reason for its movement. The crying was now accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible whispering. Sarah approached the crib, her heart pounding. As she peered inside, she was met with an empty space, except for an old, tattered baby blanket. The blanket was moving slightly, as though something was shifting underneath it. With a shaking hand, Sarah lifted the blanket. Beneath it was an old photograph of a young woman holding a baby, her face eerily familiar. The woman in the photo looked strikingly like the shadowy figure in the attic mirror. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Spinning around, she saw nothing but the empty basement. But the crying was now louder, echoing all around her. The temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath fogging in front of her face. The whispering grew more insistent, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Panicked, Sarah raced back upstairs. She woke Jake, her voice trembling as she told him about the basement, the mirror, and the crying. Jake, groggy but concerned, agreed to check it out with her. They descended together, but the basement was silent and still. The crib was stationary, the blanket lying still and undisturbed. Jake tried to reassure Sarah, suggesting it was just nerves from the stress of moving. They went back to bed, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She lay awake, every creak of the house making her jump. In the early hours of the morning, Sarah heard a soft, gentle knock on their bedroom door. She was too scared to move, but Jake was already half asleep. As she listened, the knocking became more persistent, a steady rhythm that seemed to be coming from the other side of the door. Finally, Sarah mustered the courage to open it. The hallway was empty, but a cold draft swept through, sending shivers down her spine. As she turned back into the room, she saw a figure standing at the foot of their bed. It was the woman from the mirror, her face now fully visible and etched with sorrow. The figure extended a hand toward Sarah, and the room seemed to fill with a mournful wail. In an instant, the figure vanished, leaving only an oppressive silence and the echo of its lament. Jake woke up, groggy and confused, but Sarah could only cling to him, her mind racing. They decided to leave the house immediately, unable to shake the feeling that something malevolent was waiting for them. As they packed their essentials and prepared to leave, the house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Every room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. As they drove away, Sarah looked back at the house, its once charming facade now seeming to twist into a menacing sneer. They didn't stop until they reached a nearby motel, where they spent a sleepless night. The next day, they returned to the house to gather the last of their belongings. To their shock, the place had been completely transformed. The vibrant wallpaper had peeled away, revealing cracks and mold. The once grand staircase was now dusty and decrepit. The mirror in the attic was shattered, its fragments scattered across the floor. Sarah and Jake never spoke of the house again. They sold it as quickly as they could, and it sat vacant for months before a new family moved in. The new occupants, drawn by the house's historical charm, soon reported strange occurrences, cold drafts, whispers in the night, and the feeling of being watched. They didn't stay long. Years later, Sarah and Jake would occasionally hear rumors about their old house, stories of a family that had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. They would shudder and try to forget, but sometimes, late at night, they would hear a distant, haunting cry. It was a reminder of the sorrowful presence they had encountered in their short-lived nightmare of a home. The house remained empty, a testament to a tragic past that the new owners might never fully understand. Its dark history became a legend among locals, a chilling tale of what happens when the past refuses to stay buried.